In a small town in America, there was a high school that looked like any other. The classrooms were filled with the usual mix of students, some quiet, some loud, and some just trying to get through the day without being noticed. But among them was one student who stood out, not because he caused trouble or tried too hard to fit in, but because he carried himself differently. He wasn't loud or flashy, but there was something about him that made people curious. This student had recently transferred to the school from another district. He didn't talk much about his past, but it was clear he wasn't used to the way things worked here. The school wasn't known for being welcoming to newcomers, especially those who looked different or came from unfamiliar backgrounds. Some kids whispered behind his back, wondering why he seemed so confident even though he was new. Others gave him sideways glances, unsure of how to approach him. But there was one person who didn't care about curiosity or politeness. His name wasn't important, but everyone knew him as the bully. This guy had been ruling the hallways for years, feeding off fear and intimidation. He picked on anyone who seemed weaker than him, whether it was someone smaller, quieter, or just different. It wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was a nasty comment, a shove in the hallway, or a cruel prank. Whatever it was, it left its mark. And today it felt like his attention had landed on the new kid. It happened during 5th period history class. The teacher had stepped out for a moment, leaving the room buzzing with low chatter. Most students were busy talking or scrolling through their phones, but the tension between the two boys at the back of the room was impossible to ignore. The bully leaned over and shoved the new student hard into his desk. The sound echoed in the room, and for a second, everything went silent. Everyone turned to see what would happen next. The new student didn't flinch. He didn't shout or push back. Instead, he slowly straightened up and locked eyes with the bully. There was no anger in his gaze, no panic, just a calm intensity that sent shivers down the spines of everyone watching. For the first time, the bully hesitated. Something about this kid was different. He wasn't reacting the way others usually did. No one said a word as the teacher walked back in, breaking the spell. Class resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted. Students exchanged glances, silently asking each other what they thought would happen next. Would the new kid retaliate? Would he tell the teacher? Or would he let it slide and pretend nothing happened? What no one realized was that this moment was more than just a random act of bullying. It was the start of something bigger, something that would change the entire school in ways no one could have predicted. By lunchtime, rumors were already spreading like wildfire. Videos of the incident started popping up online, and hashtags began trending locally. Parents called the school, demanding answers. Teachers huddled in meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. And all the while, the new student stayed eerily calm, almost as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Little did anyone know this wasn't just any ordinary kid. He came from a family with a strong sense of discipline and resilience. Back in his old school, he'd been part of programs that taught leadership, conflict resolution, and even self-defense. His parents had raised him to think before acting, to stay composed under pressure, and to never let anyone else's actions dictate his response. These lessons weren't just words. They were a way of life. And now, sitting quietly in that classroom, he was putting them into practice. As the day wore on, the bully couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake. Normally, after pulling a stunt like this, he'd feel invincible. But this time was different. Every glance from the new student felt like a challenge, every moment of silence like a ticking clock. For the first time, the bully started to wonder, who exactly had he picked on, and what was going to happen next? The tension hung heavy in the air, and everyone could feel it. No one knew it yet, but this single act of aggression was about to set off a chain reaction that would leave the entire school reeling. The moment the bell rang to signal the end of 5th period, the hallway erupted into chaos. Students poured out of classrooms, their voices rising over the sound of lockers slamming shut. But amidst the usual commotion, one topic dominated every conversation: the incident in history class. Everyone had seen it, heard about it, or was now watching videos of it on their phones. The shove, the silence, and the unshakable calmness of the new student. It was all anyone could talk about. Did you see how he just stared at him? One girl whispered to her friend as they walked toward the cafeteria. I thought for sure there'd be a fight. I know, right? Her friend replied, glancing around to make sure no teachers were listening. But he didn't even blink. Like, what is he? Some kind of superhero? Speculation ran wild. Some students thought the new kid was planning revenge, maybe waiting until after school to confront the bully outside. Others figured he'd go straight to the principal's office and get the bully suspended. A few dared to suggest that maybe nothing would happen at all, that the new kid might just let it slide. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't over. Something big was brewing and nobody wanted to miss it. Meanwhile, the bully himself was starting to feel uneasy. Normally, after pulling a move like that, he'd strut through the halls with his chest puffed out, basking in the fear he'd instilled. But today was different. Every step he took felt heavier, every glance from his classmates more loaded. He kept replaying the scene in his head, the shove, the silence, those piercing eyes staring back at him. Why hadn't the new kid reacted? Was he plotting something? Or worse, was he completely unbothered? By lunchtime, the tension had reached a fever pitch. In the cafeteria, clusters of students huddled together, whispering excitedly. Phones buzzed, nonstop as videos of the incident spread across social media, faster than anyone could keep up. Hashtags like Young Stand Up and Real Talk started trending locally, drawing attention not just from students but from parents and teachers too. Even people who didn't go to the school were chiming in, sharing opinions and debating what should happen next. For the new student, though, none of this seemed to matter. He sat quietly at a corner table, eating his sandwich without so much as a glance at the growing frenzy around him. Occasionally, someone would walk by and try to catch his eye, hoping for some kind of reaction, but he remained unfazed, almost as if he were miles away from the drama unfolding in real time. This only added fuel to the fire. People began digging deeper, trying to uncover anything they could about the mysterious transfer student. Rumors flew left and right. Some said he used to live in another country, while others claimed he came from a strict military family. One particularly persistent group of students managed to track down an old yearbook photo from his previous school. In it, he was standing front and center at some kind of leadership event surrounded by trophies and certificates. Suddenly, everyone realized this wasn't just any kid. He was smart, disciplined, and clearly not someone to mess with lightly. As the day wore on, the pressure mounted, not just on the new student but on the bully too. His usual crew of followers started acting distant, unsure of where things stood. They'd always backed him up before, laughing along with his jokes and cheering him on during his power trips. But now they weren't so quick to jump to his defense. In fact, a couple of them avoided him altogether, muttering excuses about having homework or needing to study when he tried to rally them for support. Even the bully's own friends noticed something was off. "You okay, man?" one of them asked, cautiously during gym class. "You've been acting weird ever since, you know." "Yeah, I'm fine," the bully snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He couldn't shake the image of those steady eyes boring into him. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, a feeling he didn't know how to handle. It gnawed at him, eating away at the bravado he'd built his reputation on. By the end of the school day, the entire atmosphere had shifted. Teachers called emergency meetings to discuss how to address the situation. Parents bombarded the administration with calls and emails, demanding answers. And students continued to speculate, their theories growing wilder with each passing hour. Would the new kid retaliate? Would the bully face consequences? Or would the whole thing blow over without resolution? No one had the answers yet. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next would change everything. The school was divided, not just between those who supported the bully and those who sided with the new student, but also among those who simply didn't know what to think. Everyone was waiting, watching, wondering. And in the middle of it all, the new student stayed calm. He didn't post anything online, didn't seek revenge, and didn't break his silence. If anything, his composure only made the anticipation grow stronger. People couldn't help but admire his restraint, even as they questioned what he might be planning. Was he biding his time? Gathering evidence? preparing to strike back in a way no one saw coming? Whatever it was, the stage was set. The school had become a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. All it would take was one move, one decision, to tip the scales and send shockwaves through the entire community. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. The next morning, the air in the school felt heavier than usual. Whispers filled the hallways as students filed into their classrooms, glancing over their shoulders to see if anything would happen. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But instead of chaos, something unexpected happened. During third period, the principal made an announcement over the intercom. "Attention, students," her voice crackled through the speakers. "We will be holding a special assembly this afternoon to discuss important issues affecting our school community. Attendance is mandatory." She didn't say much more, but the message was clear. Whatever had been brewing since the incident in history class was about to come to a head. By lunchtime, speculation was at an all-time high. Some kids thought the new student had finally gone to the principal and demanded justice. Others believed the bully's friends had reported him to save themselves from getting dragged into trouble. A few even joked that maybe aliens had landed on the football field and the assembly was just a cover story. No one really knew what to expect, but one thing was certain. The entire school would be there, eyes glued to the stage, looking for answers. When the time came, the auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Students filed in row by row, squeezing into seats or leaning against the walls when there wasn't enough space. Teachers stood watchfully at the edges of the room, trying to keep order but failing miserably. The chatter grew louder and louder until the principal stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. With a single tap to test the sound, she silenced the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her tone serious but calm. "Today, we're here to talk about something that affects us all: respect, responsibility, and how we treat each other in the school." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We've invited a few students to share their thoughts because ultimately, it's up to you to shape the kind of environment we have here." At first, no one moved. Everyone looked around, wondering who would dare speak up. Then, out of nowhere, the new student stood up. He walked slowly toward the stage, his steps steady and deliberate. The room went completely quiet as he climbed the stairs and took the microphone from the principal. For a moment, he just stood there, scanning the sea of faces staring back at him. And then, without hesitation, he began to speak. "I'm not here to point fingers or make anyone feel bad," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "What happened yesterday? It wasn't okay. But I also know that reacting with anger or violence doesn't solve anything. It just creates more problems." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Bullying happens because people feel powerless. They think putting someone else down will make them feel stronger. But it doesn't work that way. Real strength comes from understanding each other, not tearing each other apart." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. No one dared to interrupt as he spoke, his words hitting home harder than anyone expected. He talked about his own experiences, growing up, about times when he'd felt like an outsider, and how those moments had shaped him. He didn't go into details, but it was clear he'd faced challenges most people couldn't imagine. Yet, through it all, he'd learned the value of patience, empathy, and standing up for what's right. Not with fists, but with actions. "I'm not saying it's easy," he continued. "It's hard to stay calm when someone hurts you. It's hard to forgive when you feel wronged. But if we want to change things, if we want to make this school a better place, we have to start somewhere. And I believe we can do that together." When he finished speaking, the auditorium erupted into applause. Students clapped and cheered, some even standing up to show their support. Teachers wiped away tears, moved by the maturity and courage of a teenager who'd handled such a difficult situation with grace. Even the principal looked visibly emotional as she stepped back onto the stage to thank him. But while the majority of the crowd was inspired, not everyone shared the same reaction. Sitting near the back of the room, the bully shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Every word the new student had spoken felt like a direct hit, exposing truths he'd spent years trying to ignore. For the first time, he realized how hollow his behavior had been, all the shoving, the teasing, the intimidation. None of it had ever made him feel truly powerful. If anything, it had only made him feel worse. As the assembly wrapped up, the mood in the school shifted. Students left the auditorium talking animatedly, sharing their thoughts about the speech and what it meant for the future. Some vowed to be kinder to others, while others promised to stand up against bullying whenever they saw it. It was as if the new student's words had lit a spark, a small flame of hope that spread quickly through the halls. But for the bully, the weight of the day only grew heavier. He tried to blend into the background as everyone dispersed, avoiding eye contact and keeping his head down. Normally, he thrived on attention, feeding off the fear and admiration of his peers. But now, he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Later that afternoon, during study hall, one of his closest friends pulled him aside. "Hey man, are you all right?" The friend asked cautiously, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "You've been acting weird ever since." "Well, you know." The bully hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to put on his usual tough guy act and pretend everything was fine. But another part, the part that had been quietly crumbling under the pressure, couldn't hold it together anymore. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. I don't know. I guess I never thought about it like that before." His friend frowned, sensing the vulnerability beneath the surface. "Like what?" "That maybe I'm the problem," the bully admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That maybe I've been doing all this stuff because I don't know how else to deal with things." For the rest of the day, the bully retreated inward, wrestling with emotions he'd buried for years. Memories surfaced, memories of arguments at home, feelings of neglect, and the constant need to prove himself. He'd always told himself that being tough was the only way to survive, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe there was another way. Maybe, just maybe, he could change. Unbeknownst to him, the new student was watching from afar, observing the subtle shifts in the bully's demeanor. He didn't gloat or revel in the impact of his speech. Instead, he simply waited, giving the bully space to process what had happened. Deep down, he knew that real change didn't happen overnight. It took time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And for the first time, it seemed like the bully might actually be ready to take that step. As the final bell rang and students spilled out of the building, the school felt different. There was still tension, still uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days that followed the assembly felt like a strange mix of calm and chaos. On one hand, the school seemed quieter, fewer arguments in the hallways, less mocking laughter during lunch, and even some hesitant smiles between students who had once ignored each other. But beneath the surface, emotions were simmering. The bully in particular was struggling to find his footing. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. At first, he tried to act normal. He cracked jokes with his friends, threw out insults when someone crossed him, and strutted through the halls like nothing had changed. But it didn't feel right anymore. Every snide comment he made sounded hollow. Every shove he gave felt weaker than the last. Even his closest friends noticed something was off. They'd catch him staring into space or zoning out mid-conversation, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. One evening, after yet another long day of pretending everything was fine, the bully found himself sitting alone in his room. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates gossiping about the assembly and what it meant for him. Some were defending him, saying things like, "He's just messing around," or "Everyone makes mistakes." Others weren't so kind, calling him out for being cruel and asking why he couldn't leave people alone. It was overwhelming, but not as much as the voice inside his own head, the one that kept replaying the new student's words over and over again. Real strength comes from understanding each other, not tearing each other apart. Those words haunted him. At first, he tried to brush them off, telling himself they didn't matter. But the more he thought about them, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Deep down, he knew he wasn't strong. He wasn't powerful. He bullied others because it made him feel in control, like he mattered. But now, for the first time, he realized how empty that feeling really was. All those years of pushing people around hadn't made him stronger. It had made him weaker. And the worst part? Everyone could see it. That night, unable to shake the weight of his thoughts, the bully broke down. He sat on the edge of his bed, burying his face in his hands as tears streamed down his cheeks. For so long, he'd convinced himself that being tough meant never showing weakness. But now, here he was, crying like a kid because he didn't know how to fix the mess he'd created. He hated himself for it, but he also knew he couldn't keep going like this. The next morning, his parents noticed something was wrong. They weren't always the most attentive, busy with their own lives and arguments, but even they could tell their son was different. His mom sat him down at the kitchen table before school and asked, "What's going on with you lately? You've been acting, I don't know, distant?" For a moment, he considered brushing her off like usual. But then, surprising even himself, he opened up. He told her about the incident in history class, the speech at the assembly, and how everyone looked at him differently now. He admitted that he bullied people because he didn't know how else to deal with his feelings. Feelings of anger, frustration, and loneliness that had been building up for years. By the time he finished talking, his voice was shaking, and tears were streaming down his face again. His mom listened quietly, her expression softening as she realized how much pain her son had been carrying. When he finished, she pulled him into a hug, a rare moment of connection between them, and promised to help him figure things out. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, the bully felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone. Later that week, the school counselor called him into her office. She'd heard about the incident and wanted to check in, making it clear that she wasn't there to punish him, but to understand what was going on. At first, he resisted, putting up walls and deflecting her questions with sarcasm. But eventually, he broke down again, confessing everything he'd been feeling. The counselor listened patiently, offering advice and resources to help him work through his struggles. She even suggested he join a peer mentoring program designed to teach leadership skills and conflict resolution. By the end of the meeting, the bully felt exhausted but lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that change was possible, that he didn't have to be defined by his past actions. But there was still one thing he needed to do: apologize. Apologizing wasn't easy. In fact, it terrified him. What if the new student rejected him? What if everyone laughed at him for being weak? Those fears gnawed at him, but deep down he knew it was the right thing to do. So one afternoon during lunch, he mustered up every ounce of courage he had and approached the new student, who was sitting quietly at a corner table. "Hey," the bully said, his voice trembling as he stood there awkwardly. "Can we talk?" The new student looked up, surprised but calm. After a pause, he nodded and gestured for the bully to sit down. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Finally, the bully took a deep breath and blurted out, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done what I did. You didn't deserve that." The new student studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology," he said simply. "But words aren't enough. Actions matter more." The bully swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. "I know. That's why I want to make things right. If you'll let me, I'd like to help however I can, to prove I mean it." To his surprise, the new student smiled faintly. "There's actually something you can do," he said. "We're starting a project to reduce bullying in the school. It's about teaching respect and empathy, helping people understand each other better. Would you be willing to help lead it?" The bully blinked, stunned. He'd expected rejection, maybe even ridicule. But this was a chance to turn things around, not just for himself, but for the entire school. Slowly, he nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice steadier now. I'll do it. Over the next few weeks, the two of them worked together to organize workshops, discussions, and activities aimed at fostering kindness and understanding among students. At first, the bully struggled. He stumbled over his words during presentations, fumbled through icebreaker games, and often second-guessed whether anyone would take him seriously. But with each passing day, he grew more confident. Students began to notice the effort he was putting in, and while some were skeptical at first, many eventually came to respect him for trying to change. Even his friends started to see him differently. Instead of egging him on to pick fights or tease others, they joined him in supporting the anti-bullying initiatives. One by one, they stepped up, sharing their own stories and encouraging others to do the same. Slowly but surely, the culture of the school began to shift. Conversations became more open, friendships formed across cliques, and conflicts were resolved with dialogue instead of aggression. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of doubt, setbacks, and challenges along the way. Some students refused to participate, dismissing the efforts as pointless or fake. Others mocked the bully behind his back, accusing him of doing it for attention. But none of that stopped him. With the support of the new student, the counselor, and a growing group of allies, he pushed forward, determined to see the project through. By the end of the semester, the transformation was undeniable. The school wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was better. People smiled more, argued less, and treated each other with a newfound sense of care and respect. Awards ceremonies highlighted not just academic achievements but acts of kindness and leadership. Teachers praised the progress, parents expressed relief, and students felt proud to be part of a community that valued empathy over cruelty. And as for the bully, he was no longer just the bully. To many, he was now someone who had faced his flaws, owned up to his mistakes, and worked hard to become a better person. It wasn't an easy journey, and it certainly wasn't over. But, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. A path paved with humility, growth, and hope for a brighter future. The weeks following the bully's apology marked a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire school. What started as a shaky truce between two unlikely allies had blossomed into something bigger, a movement that brought students together in ways no one could have predicted. The anti-bullying project they launched wasn't just about stopping fights or ending teasing. It was about creating a space where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. At first, the idea of working alongside the bully seemed strange to many students. Some were skeptical, wondering if he was truly sincere or just putting on a show to avoid getting in trouble. Others flat out refused to participate, crossing their arms and muttering under their breath whenever his name came up. But, over time, attitudes began to shift. People watched as he poured effort into organizing workshops, leading discussions, and mentoring younger kids who struggled with confidence. Slowly, grudging respect turned into genuine admiration. One of the most impactful moments came during a school-wide assembly. The new student stood on stage again, this time introducing the bully to speak. As he walked up to the microphone, the room fell silent. Everyone leaned forward in their seats, curious to hear what he would say. For a moment he froze, gripping the mic tightly as sweat beaded on his forehead. Then, taking a deep breath, he began. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "What I did was wrong, plain and simple. I hurt people because I thought it made me stronger, but all it did was make me weaker. It took someone showing me a better way for me to realize that." He paused, scanning the crowd. His eyes landed on familiar faces, friends who'd once cheered him on during his power trips, teachers who'd written him off as a lost cause, and classmates who'd feared him for years. Each pair of eyes told a different story, but none looked away. Encouraged by their attention, he continued. "I'm not saying I've fixed everything. I haven't. I still mess up sometimes. But I'm trying. And I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I can be better." When he finished speaking, the auditorium erupted into applause. Students clapped and cheered, some even standing to show their support. Teachers exchanged Proud glances, and even the principal smiled warmly from her seat near the front. It was a moment of redemption, not just for the bully, but for everyone who had doubted whether change was possible. But the real work happened outside of assemblies and speeches. Behind the scenes, the two students collaborated tirelessly to build programs that addressed the root causes of bullying. They organized small group discussions where kids could share their experiences without fear of judgment. They created art, projects that encouraged self-expression, giving students an outlet for emotions they might otherwise bottle up. And perhaps most importantly, they taught conflict resolution skills, showing others how to handle disagreements without resorting to aggression. For the bully, these activities became more than just tasks. They were opportunities to rewrite his own narrative. Every time he helped mediate a disagreement or guided a shy student through a workshop, he proved to himself that he was capable of making a positive impact. He started seeing himself differently, not as someone defined by past mistakes, but as someone actively working toward a brighter future. Still, not every day was easy. There were moments when old habits threatened to resurface. During gym class one afternoon, a smaller kid accidentally bumped into him while running laps. Instinctively, the bully clenched his fists, ready to lash out. But then, he caught sight of the new student watching from across the court, his expression calm yet expectant. That look was enough to stop him cold. Instead of reacting angrily, the bully forced himself to take a step back, breathe deeply, and simply say, "Hey, watch where you're going, okay?" It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the semester wore on, the ripple effects of their efforts became impossible to ignore. Students who had once kept to themselves now joined clubs and sports teams, eager to connect with peers they'd never spoken to before. Friendships formed across cliques, breaking down barriers that had long divided the school. Even the lunchroom dynamic changed. Tables that had once been rigidly segregated by social groups now hosted lively conversations between students from all walks of life. Parents noticed the difference too. At parent-teacher conferences, moms and dads expressed relief at seeing their children come home happier and more confident. "My kid used to dread coming to school," one mother admitted during a meeting with the principal. "Now she talks about her friends and the projects she's working on. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Of course, there were still challenges. Not everyone bought into the changes right away. A few students continued to resist, mocking the initiatives as too soft or claiming they didn't need lessons on kindness. Some parents complained that the focus on empathy was distracting from academics, and occasionally tensions flared when old rivalries resurfaced. But even in those moments, the foundation they'd built held strong. When conflicts arose, students relied on the tools they'd learned to resolve them peacefully rather than escalating into full-blown fights. By spring break, the transformation was undeniable. The school buzzed with energy, but it was a different kind of energy than before. Calmer, warmer, and more inclusive. Awards ceremonies celebrated not only academic achievements, but also acts of courage and compassion. Yearbook photos captured smiles instead of scowls, hugs instead of shoves. Even the graffiti-covered walls of the bathrooms got a makeover, covered in colorful murals painted by students eager to leave their mark in a positive way. And through it all, the bond between the bully and the new student grew stronger. What had started as an uneasy partnership evolved into a genuine friendship. They weren't alike. In fact, they were polar opposites in many ways, but that's what made their connection so powerful. Together, they showed the school that differences didn't have to divide, they could unite. On the last day of the school year, the two stood side by side on stage at the annual awards ceremony. The principal called them up to present a special recognition, a plaque honoring their leadership in transforming the school's culture. As they accepted the award, the crowd gave them a standing ovation, cheering louder than ever before. Backstage. Afterward, the bully turned to the new student and grinned. "You know," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "if you'd told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing here like this, I wouldn't have believed you." The new student chuckled. "Well, believe it," he replied, "because you earned it." As they walked off stage together, surrounded by classmates patting them on the back and congratulating them, neither could help but feel a sense of pride, not just in what they'd accomplished, but in the knowledge that they'd sparked something lasting. The school wasn't perfect, and neither were they, but they'd proven that even the hardest hearts could soften, that even the deepest divides could be bridged, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could lead to the biggest changes. As the final weeks of the school year ticked by, the changes at the school felt permanent, like they weren't just a passing phase but a new way of life. The hallways were quieter, not because people were afraid to speak, but because there was less yelling and more laughter. Students greeted each other with genuine smiles instead of side-eye glances or muttered insults. Even the teachers seemed lighter, cracking jokes in class and encouraging students to share their thoughts without fear of ridicule. For the bully, the transformation wasn't just external, it ran deep inside him too. Every morning, he woke up feeling a little less weighed down by guilt and shame. He no longer craved attention through intimidation. Instead, he found joy in lifting others up. Whether it was helping a struggling student with math homework or breaking up arguments before they escalated, he had become someone people trusted. It wasn't always easy, and he still made mistakes, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he kept trying and everyone could see it. The new student, on the other hand, remained the steady force he'd always been. While some kids might have let the success go to their heads, he stayed humble, focusing on keeping the momentum alive. During lunch breaks, he could often be found sitting with smaller groups of students, listening to their concerns or brainstorming ideas for future projects. His calm demeanor and thoughtful advice inspired others to step up and take ownership of the positive culture they'd created together. One afternoon, as the weather warmed and the end-of-year excitement grew, the two friends decided to organize one last event, a gratitude day, where students could write thank you notes to anyone who had made a difference in their lives. Posters went up around the school, inviting everyone to participate. At first, some students shrugged it off, thinking it sounded cheesy. But when the day arrived, something remarkable happened. Tables were set up in the courtyard, covered with colorful paper, markers, and stickers. Students gathered hesitantly at first, unsure of what to write or who to thank. But then someone broke the ice. A shy freshman scribbled a note thanking a senior for sticking up for her during a tough moment. Another student wrote about how a teacher's encouragement had helped them pass a hard test. Slowly, the floodgates opened. By the end of the day, hundreds of notes covered the tables, each one filled with heartfelt words of appreciation. Even the bully joined in, penning a note to the new student. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did," he wrote. "You showed me that I can be better, and I'll never forget it." When the new student read it later, he smiled softly and tucked it away in his backpack, knowing it would remind him of how far they'd both come. But Gratitude Day wasn't just about celebrating individual acts of kindness. It was about recognizing the collective effort that had transformed the school. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire student body gathered on the football field for a closing ceremony. Lanterns lit up the dark sky, casting a warm glow over the crowd. One by one, students stood up to share stories of how the year had changed them. A girl spoke about overcoming her fear of speaking in front of others after joining the drama club. A boy talked about finding confidence through the anti-bullying workshops. Even teachers chimed in, sharing how proud they were of the resilience and compassion their students had shown. Each story added another layer to the tapestry of growth that had unfolded throughout the year. When it was the bully's turn to speak, the field fell silent. Holding the microphone tightly, he looked out at the sea of faces illuminated by lantern light. For a moment he hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he wanted to say. Then, taking a deep breath, he began. "This year taught me something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It taught me that we're all connected, that your pain is my pain, and your happiness is my happiness. None of us are alone, even when it feels like we are." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I used to think being tough meant never showing weakness, but now I know that real strength comes from admitting when you're wrong, asking for help, and working together to make things better. And that's exactly what we've done here. Together. His speech ended with thunderous applause, echoing across the field like waves crashing against the shore. Tears streamed down faces, hugs were exchanged, and promises were made to keep the spirit of kindness alive beyond graduation. As the ceremony wrapped up and students drifted home, the impact of the year lingered in the air. Parents noticed subtle shifts in their children, more patience, more empathy, and a willingness to stand up for what was right. Teachers marveled at how much the school had grown, vowing to carry the lessons forward into the next year. And alumni, hearing about the changes online, reached out to express pride in seeing their old school embrace such meaningful progress. Months later, long after summer break had begun, the effects continued to ripple outward. Former students carried the values they'd learned into college dorms, workplaces, and communities. Some started similar initiatives in their new schools, spreading the message of empathy and respect. Others simply lived by example, treating strangers with kindness and standing up against injustice wherever they saw it. Back at the high school, preparations were already underway for the following year. New banners hung in the hall, words on kindness starts here, respect is everything, and we rise together. Freshman orientation included sessions on conflict resolution and inclusivity, ensuring that incoming students understood the expectations and values of the community they were joining. Even the local news picked up on the story, highlighting the school as a model for tackling bullying and fostering unity. Looking back, the bully often thought about how different his life might have been if none of this had happened. Would he still be shoving kids in the hallway, feeding off fear to mask his own insecurities? Or worse, would he have carried those habits into adulthood, damaging relationships and opportunities along the way? He didn't like to dwell on those questions too much. They only reminded him of how close he'd come to losing himself completely. Instead, he focused on the present and the future, determined to continue growing into the person he wanted to be. The new student, meanwhile, remained a quiet hero, not seeking recognition but inspiring others simply by being himself. Though he eventually graduated and moved on to bigger challenges, his legacy stayed behind, woven into the fabric of the school. Teachers told his story to new classes, using it as an example of courage and leadership. Students whispered about him in awe, wondering if they could ever measure up to the standard he'd set. But the truth was, he hadn't asked anyone to be like him. He'd only encouraged them to be their best selves. In the end, the story wasn't just about one bully or one transfer student. It was about a community coming together to create something beautiful out of chaos. It was about redemption, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Most importantly, it was proof that change was possible. Not overnight, not easily, but steadily and surely, one small act of kindness at a time. And so, as the years rolled on and new faces filled the halls, the memory of that transformative year lived on, not as a distant chapter in the school's history, but as a living reminder of what could happen when people chose to rise above hatred and build bridges instead of walls.